All right, and we are live. Hi, everyone. My name is Jackie Heaney, and I am the coordinator for the Healthy St. Mary's Partnership via the Health Department. Thank you for joining us for our Eat, Live, and Be Healthy webinar series today with Erin Jewell here again from the University of Maryland Extension. Just some quick housekeeping before we get started. This is being recorded, and recordings from this series will be available on our website, healthystmarys.com/eat, live, and be healthy. If you have any questions throughout, if you're viewing live, you can post the questions at any time in the comments or the chat functions on Facebook or YouTube. And we'll answer them at the end of the session here. And if you're reviewing the recording, you can always email questions over to us at stmaryspartnership@gmail.com. On that note, I'll stop sharing my screen and throw it over to Erin.
Thanks, Jackie. So fingers crossed that we don't experience any more issues. And let me just see if I can get my screen shared with you guys. Okay. Also, I just have to forewarn everyone, I'm on a mobile hotspot. We had some storms in the area, and I think my internet's a little glitchy. So I'll notice if my light goes out, which means I need to connect back with you all. But hi there, I'm Erin Jewell. I work for the University of Maryland Extension, as Jackie mentioned. And specifically, I am in the Department of Family and Consumer Sciences. So I teach about different healthy living topics out in the Calvert, Charles, and St. Mary's counties. And so without further ado, let's start with talking about Capture the Flavor, Herbs and Spices, which is a program offered through Extension. And we have other food preservation programs that we offer in our Grow It, Eat It, Preserve It series. And this is kind of a subcategory of one of those in which we specifically focus on herbs and spices. So hopefully you guys are seeing learning objectives. Jackie, let me know if you're not. And I'll just go ahead and keep thinking that you guys are.
You're good to go.
Okay, awesome. Just making sure. So hopefully by the end of tonight, you guys will have learned some new ways of using herbs and spices from a cultural perspective. Hopefully you'll have understood some best practices for storing herbs and spices and recognize how herbs and spices are processed safely. And then identify some health benefits and cooking tips when using herbs and spices in your dishes. And so to cover those objectives, this is the agenda of tonight. We'll start off with the history, then we'll go into the cooking aspects and tips. We'll talk about storage, food safety, and then we'll conclude with the health benefits of herbs and spices. So let's start off by talking about the history. So spices today, as you guys are very aware, are plentiful, and we mostly use them as flavoring elements. However, in ancient and medieval times, they were very rare and a precious commodity. And they were used as medicine, perfumes, incense, and as flavorings as well. And I just, want to pose for you guys to think about what it would be like if we didn't have herbs and spices. I think many of your favorite dishes you would find would be super bland, and you would be craving and wanting something a little bit more. So herbs and spices were first kind of discovered in that 3000 BC era, and different civilizations kind of took over the trading of herbs and spices and controlled that trade on and off. And this went all the way through 1200 AD. And then we see that there was the use of herbs and spices medicinally as well during that time period. And then Europe sought to improve their economy, and so they acquired spices and gold for better, faster trading routes. And then the spice trade wars occurred, and that was mostly in Europe between Spain, Portugal, England, and Holland. And then we see in the 17th to 20th century, America entered the urban spice trade. And really these became popular for their culinary use, for some health use. And little fun fact, So Salem, Massachusetts became the center of the spice trade in North America. So it's not just known for the Salem witch trials. And this is kind of a fun map. It's very, overstimulating, but it shows you globally where spices and herbs are grown and harvested. So it's really cool to kind of find something that interests you, find an herb or spice, maybe that's your favorite, and to find its country of origin and then see how dishes in that area are commonly use that herb or spice as a predominant flavoring element to that dish. And then so thanks to the early spice trade and now currently the easy access, we can create dishes that are representative of countries from across the world, which is really cool. And so this is just showing you guys some herbs and spices that are predominantly used in different cultural cuisines. So we see, like, for example, different Mexican dishes use a lot of chili powder, cinnamon, garlic, oregano, cumin, coriander. Whereas French dishes, they use a lot of like herbs we're seeing. We see Indian cuisine or dishes have those really bright herbs and spices that you might be familiar with, like turmeric and the curry powder, which give it those bright flavors for a lot of the dishes you might be thinking of. And then this is a really neat kind of way to talk about how you can explore even further new international flavors by adding these spice blends to your favorite grain, protein, or vegetable dishes. And so I'll try and work with Jackie on making some of these resources available if you want to try out different blends with some suggestions of veggie, protein, and grain options that you might cook with on a regular basis and want to try at home. So that kind of covers the history. We're caught up to speed. We're in the present. And now, I don't know if your mouth is watering or if you're just like kind of intrigued by some new herbs and spices you've never heard of that you want to try. But we're going to talk about some cooking tips on how to best use and amplify the flavors and the aromas and the other elements of different herbs and spices. But first, we have to distinguish the difference between herbs and spices because you might hear me slip up and just say one of them over the other because it's hard to keep saying herbs and spices. But they are different things and they are different parts of a plant. So they're both from the plant, but they cover different areas and they add flavor to our foods and they're used for other purposes as well. But so the herb part of the plant is predominantly the leaf of low-growing shrub. So you see there's an example of an herb on the very left. Whereas spices come from the other parts of the plant. So that could be the root, the bark, the bud, the fruit, berries, flowers, and seeds. So it's the other plant component. You may hear of different herb and spice flavorings, and that is an extract of herb or spices used for savory purposes, but it doesn't actually contain plant parts. And then seasoning blends are a combination of just herbs or a combination of just spices or a combination of both to make like a blend of these. So maybe some of you are looking at these pictures and trying to guess what they are. And I'm going to go through the answers. If you get them right, awesome. But the herb that you're seeing is cilantro. The kind of black, red, and white little speckled balls are peppercorns. The bark that you see represented there is cinnamon. The seed example is coriander. And then the root is ginger. So those are some different examples of the different parts of the plant as herbs and spices that we commonly see and use. And the cool part about cooking with herbs and spices is it really adds to the joy of the eating experience and the drinking experience even because it enhances the flavors, the aromas, the freshness, and even the colors of some of your favorite dishes. There's a lot of contrast that can be added and make it a more enjoyable experience. When you cook with herbs and spices, it also can encourage healthier eating practices. So we see that it can help you increase your willingness to try maybe foods you don't normally enjoy eating, like vegetables or low-fat foods, because it adds a natural burst of flavor to those dishes. And then it also helps you to reduce the fat and the sugar and salt that you're putting into dishes by substituting. And we'll talk about that more later. Herbs and spices also contain small amounts of trace nutrients, such as phytochemicals, and an example of that is antioxidants. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then herbs and spices can also suppress or destroy harmful foodborne pathogens. And so they can be used sort of as a preservative. And we will go into more detail with that later. So you may not be as familiar with the term volatiles, but another way of saying this is essential oils. And these are the aromatic chemicals that can be found in herbs and spices. They give it that like really distinct smell when you rub it between your fingers, or when you're out in the garden and you're smelling something fresh, or you're opening up a bottle in your kitchen about to pour it into a recipe. And so these essential oils make up a certain percentage of herbs and spices. And dried spices actually have more. They have 5 to 15% essential oil by weight, whereas dried and fresh herbs have much less. They have less than 1% by weight. Now, you can increase these aromatic chemicals and these pleasant aromas and flavors by increasing the temperature of herbs and spices. But the trick is to do it at the right time and using certain cooking methods. So some examples would be steaming or toasting, smoking, and even cooking these with oils instead of more water-based ingredients. And then also increasing the surface tension can increase these aromatic compounds. So think about, there's a big difference between using like ground rosemary versus a whole rosemary leaf. There's a lot more surface area that allows those aromatic chemicals to be released into your foods. So there's a lot of good ways to prepare and use herbs and spices in cooking that bring out those aromatic compounds. Here's some additional tips. So you want to add herbs and spices in small amounts before just suddenly increasing and thinking that the recipe is going to taste great. And an example is using peppers and chilies. It can result in a really intense outcome or really spicy surprise that you weren't expecting if you add too much. So it's always better just to add a little bit, taste test it before you try and add more. And then the tip I'm going to give to you guys tonight is if you're doubling a recipe, only increase the amount of herbs and spices you're putting in by 1 to 1.5 times instead of doubling, because the potency when you double a recipe is better if you add less at first. And then if you really are like, oh, I'm not really tasting this, it's not strong enough, then you can probably add a little bit more. So when you add fresh herbs and dried herbs or spices is important to know as well. And so when you're dealing with like delicate herbs, so for example, basil, chives, or parsley, you really want to add them at the end of the cooking process, maybe just 1 or 2 minutes before you end up serving the dish. Whereas more of your heartier herbs, like rosemary and dill seed, those can last a little bit longer and they don't deteriorate as easily. And so you can add them in the last 20 minutes of the cooking process. Dried herbs are also a good, they're a little bit hardier, and you want them to cook for a longer period of time to help release the flavors slowly. So these are things you can add actually at the beginning of the cooking process to allow them that extra slow time to release those flavors. So we talked about how heat can increase the aromatic compounds and allow them to kind of be present in your dish. But sometimes you want to be able to control this. And this is one example. If you grind, crush, or chop as a preparation method, those processes introduce heat, and that can prematurely release those good smelling aromas. So a tip that I want to give to you guys is try to pre-chill spices or like grinder type mechanisms or those equipment pieces to keep aromatics cool to prevent them from prematurely escaping when you're making your recipe. And I kind of briefly touched on this just a second ago, but oils and fats actually dissolve those aromatic compounds better than water does. So try and consider cooking with oils, or you can cook with other low water content ingredients, such as alcohols or vinegars or even sugar syrups. And then you want to always use a sharp knife. One, that's a safety thing. If you're cutting with a dull knife, you're more likely to cut yourself. But also a dull knife can cause premature discoloration. So you might see like a browning effect of maybe some like fresh herbs that you're chopping. And a dull knife also acts as that like crushing method we just talked about, which can introduce heat and release those flavor compounds when you don't want them released. So you want a sharp knife to cut through them easily and maintain a fresher flavor. And then just a tip for those of you who aren't familiar with like fresh herbs, most of them are on a sprig or like a stem. And so what you want to do is hold one end of the stem and run your finger against the grain. So that means if like the leaves are poking back this direction, you want to go against that and they will fall off the stem much easy, which makes it easy for you to destem those herbs, and then you can use them in your cooking. Okay, so these are some fresh to dry conversion that you can use with herbs and spices. And just keep in mind, these are estimates, so it's always good to use a tested and approved recipe, just so that way you have a really enjoyable outcome or a dish that's created and you're not like, oh, well, Erin told me when I have when I don't have fresh basil, if I don't have a tablespoon of chopped fresh basil, I can use a teaspoon of crumbled dry basil, but my recipe tastes terrible. Definitely like check out those tested approved recipes first. So these are just kind of some estimates that if you're like, this happens to me all the time where I don't have something in my pantry and I do have like a dried version and I will use the teaspoon method quite often. Or if you have a ground version of an herb or spice, you can use 1/4 to 1/4 teaspoon if it calls for like a tablespoon fresh or a teaspoon of dried crumbled. So those are just some tips. And then as always, if you're trying to like make your own seasoning blends, begin with blending like 1 or 2 herbs and spices, try it out. Because again, you don't want to just waste a bunch of stuff and you want to try and get the most desirable outcome. All right, so now let's move on to storing herbs and spices. And I always think it's funny. I wish this was a little bit more live where I could ask you guys to share your stories with me. But I want you to think about the last time you went into your pantry or your refrigerator and you checked to see if your herbs and spices were past their due date or if they were fresh, because we're going to talk about some methods on how to check that and to pitch the ones that are stale. So really when we talk about storing herbs and spices, we really are trying to prevent loss of flavor and color, and just to keep things fresh so that your recipes taste fresh and enjoyable. So these are the 4 storage don'ts that we want to focus on. And we'll start with air. And this is with most foods, but when you introduce oxygen into a food product, especially herbs and spices, that oxygen will oxidize the product and it diminishes their flavor and potency. So they just become really weak tasting. They're not as strong as you want them to be in your recipe. So this is why it's important when you have storage containers that you're using tightly covered containers When you're actually using them in a recipe, you want to return the lid, make sure it's screwed on tightly quickly after you've used it, meaning don't just let it sit there on the counter, because that oxygen is going to make the flavors get lost more easily. The next one in the bottom middle we'll talk about is light. And so when you expose your herbs and spices to light, it actually causes the pigments in them to deteriorate. So think about like red chili powder or your bright green herbs. Light will cause those pigments to deteriorate over time and just become more dull, again, which doesn't leave us with a very pleasant looking product. I've even seen some of my herbs and even dried herbs get like a gray color, which makes them look really unappealing. So best storage practices are to store in a dark place away from sunlight. And then we'll move up to the top middle to the heat storage don't. And what heat does is it decreases the quality of your herbs and spices. So I always see this on Pinterest and just on different media sources where people are getting really creative about how they store herbs and spices. So they'll have those like little metal containers that have a magnet on the back, and you can snap it onto your fridge, or you can put it on a hood vent, or you've come up with a really creative like rack that you made on your own, and it's sitting next to your stove, or it's sitting next to some heat source like a microwave, or just any hot element in your kitchen. Or maybe it's directly in there's a window in your kitchen where the sunlight just beams through and creates heat on your herbs and spices. So we don't recommend that. We don't recommend storing it close to any sort of heating element, because it will deteriorate their quality pretty quickly. And then lastly, we have moisture. This is also kind of self-explanatory. You don't ever want moisture getting into, especially a dried product, because that promotes mold growth, and it can also lead to loss of flavor faster. So again, you really want to try and avoid storing herbs and spices next to your refrigerator and even your freezer. Because especially in the summertime, or if you have like a hot kitchen, if you are opening and closing those doors and letting the cool come out, condensation can form on things nearby, including herbs and spice containers. And so it's really the best practice kind of overall is to store herbs and spices in a drawer or a cupboard, because then you're reducing kind of all of these elements, and you want to store them in airtight containers. And speaking of which, especially too, if you are one who uses a lot of an herb or spice and you buy in bulk, or maybe you go to the farmer's market and you buy some fresh stuff, and we'll talk about that in just a second. But you need to transfer that bulk into smaller containers that may be more airtight, or provide kind of a way to shield them from a light source. And so plastic containers can be a good option, especially if they have those tight lids. Tins are a good option, especially if you don't have storage space in like a drawer or cupboard that is really dark. And then if you have some glass options like the ones featured here, either like mason jars that have the twist on lids or the vacuum seal, or even amber glass ones to help prevent that light exposure. But really you want the tight seal, because we're trying to prevent oxygen from getting in. Okay. So this is kind of the like, when did you last check whether your herbs and spices were fresh? And so you always want to check anything that you use to cook with, if it has like a best by date. And your herbs and spices should. And this is where if you buy in bulk, you want to make sure that you take the best by information and you label those smaller containers with the name of the herb or spice, and then when it's best by. And so especially dried herbs and spices, they don't spoil where they're going to make you sick, but they do lose their flavor. So you want to just take a few minutes to check for freshness, look at the best by date. And so these are just some kind of estimate examples of how dried herbs typically last between 1 and 3 years. Whole spices are going to last between 3 and 4 years. Ground spices will last between 2 and 3 years. And then seasoning blends that we kind of talked about will last between 1 and 2 years. And a fun fact that I thought was really cool. So the exception is McCormick Spices black pepper that comes in a rectangular tin. If you own an herb or spice that is stored in a rectangular tin, it is at least 25 years old. So I guess at some point in food processing or the food industry changed over to different types of containers. And McCormick is really only known for still using the rectangular tin for their black pepper. So I'm curious if anyone at the end has an example of one of those in their pantry. I'm curious to know if they still have something that's stored that way. So this is what I was alluding to about how there's some best practices for storing fresh herbs. But first, let me just address spices. So a lot of spice companies actually don't recommend that you store spices in the refrigerator or freezer. And the reason being is, again, you kind of run that risk of condensation developing and then mold growth. And so it's just not recommended. There are a few exceptions, and that's really the kind of brightly pigmented spices like chili powder, paprika, and red pepper, because those colder temperatures can help retain those colors. But you can store fresh herbs in these various places. So out in the room, in your refrigerator, or in a freezer. And we're going to go over these 3 different methods really quickly. So if you're storing your fresh herbs out at room temperature, we would use the jar method. So you're basically going to take your fresh herbs and you're going to cut the stems using a sharp knife or scissors, and you'll fill a jar halfway with water, and then you'll place the stems that have just been cut into the water. And then you'll cover, they don't do a great job showing this in the picture, but you'll cover the jar with plastic wrap and you'll secure it with a rubber band. And the point on doing that is we're trying to prevent too much browning of those leaves. And it also kind of serves as a barrier if you have like pests or dusts that like land on your fresh herbs. So that's the jar method if you want to store something at room temperature. If you want to store your fresh herbs in the refrigerator, I would suggest using the towel method. So you would wash your herbs under cold water, and then you take a damp paper towel. You would dry off the herbs, but you would wrap them in a damp paper towel, and you want to place them in an airtight like zipper bag of some sorts. And then you would squeeze out all the air and you would store that in your refrigerator. So fairly straightforward. And then the last method, the tray method, is if you want to store herbs in your freezer. And so again, you want to wash them, you want to pat them dry. And if they're on a stem, you can use that method where you hold the stem and you rub your 2 fingers against the grain to get all the leaves off. You will spread these individual leaves onto like a baking sheet, and you'll place them in the freezer for 30 minutes. And what this 30 minutes does is it creates like individual, almost like ice blankets around each leaf. And then after the 30 minutes is up, you will take all of those individually packaged leaves and you will store them in a freezer safe bag or container. And I would also suggest that you label anything you are storing in the refrigerator and freezer, again, with the name and the date, and then, store them as you need in those different areas. And then lastly, my tip for if you are storing fresh herbs in the freezer is you want to make sure that you use these in dishes that are going to be cooked. So like a soup or a casserole, because the freezing process really doesn't help them hold their integrity. The leaves are going to become a little bit mushy when they start to thaw. So they're not great in a fresh salad. But it is really neat still to be able to use these in hot cooking methods because they still retain their flavor. They're just not going to have the same texture that you want. And this is kind of a cool way to check and test your herbs and spices for freshness, especially if you're like, ooh, I didn't write down a best by date and I'm just not quite sure. And so this is just some easy 3 different ways you can kind of check. And the first is to just simply smell it and see how strong the aroma is. And you'll know, hopefully, especially if you're really familiar with an herb or spice, if it's strong or not. And if it's very weak, it's time to toss it. The other thing you can do, it is safe to taste these herbs and spices. And so if it's lacking flavor, really bland, time to toss. And then the last thing is to look for a bright, vibrant color. And again, if it's dull or faded, it's probably faded in flavor as well. And so you really want to keep or look for freshness and use fresh ingredients because you're going to find it's going to make a very powerful difference in your dishes. So just quick, easy ways to test for freshness is to take it out, kind of rub it between your hands or put it in the palm of your hand and look and check for these 3 things. All right, so we're going to move on to the food safety kind of aspect of herbs and spices. And my coworker, Shauna Henley, or Dr. Shauna Henley, she's great. She always provides us with pictures of, and she's kind of our food safety guru. So I just wanted to give her acknowledgement here. But these are pictures that she took of some homemade infused chili oil that she made. And the purpose of showing us this is that she made this homemade infused chili oil. She stored it in an airtight, it looks like one of those mason jar vacuum sealed containers, but she's storing it in the refrigerator at proper refrigerator temperatures because this homemade infused oils have a risk of getting contaminated or the growth of a microorganism called Clostridium botulinum, which has been a side effect of this. If you ingest this foodborne illness is paralysis, which is a very serious condition. So she's trying to show us that you have to store it in proper temperatures and just to be aware that that's kind of a microorganism that likes to grow in this type of method of preparing herbs and spices. All right. So we're going to talk about processing. And the reason I'm bringing up processing is a lot of times I've personally found when I say the word processing or a processed food, I get a lot of negative responses from people that, well, that's not natural. There's a lot of, I think, misconceptions about what the idea of processing is. And so I just want to share that processing is any procedure that alters food from its natural state. Okay. And that considers that food processed. So these are examples of different processing steps that take an herb or a spice from how it's grown in the ground to maybe its dried state when you cook with it. So even the harvesting is a processing method, measuring, exporting, roasting, blending, vacuum sealing, transporting, all of those are processing methods. So it's not something necessarily to be afraid of or to think poorly of. It actually has a lot of benefits to the foods that we purchase and that we eat and we cook with. Also, kind of me showing you these process steps is I want you to be aware that there are many steps in the process where potential contamination with a foodborne illness might occur. So that's also why there might be extra steps in place to kind of control for that potential contamination. So processing, hopefully I'm going to paint a better light with this word, is really great because it can help maintain or improve the nutrient content of herbs and spices. And I've alluded to or mentioned just a couple examples about how herbs and spices contain those trace elements like phytochemicals or antioxidants that are beneficial to our health. Processing can extend the shelf life of herbs and spices and help reduce food waste. So a great example is like drying. So maybe you were really active in your garden this year and you have a ton of basil that you grew, but you realize I don't know what I'm going to do with all this basil. And that's where if you dried your basil, it can extend the shelf life and you don't have to just throw it away and it doesn't go bad. So that is a form of processing that's beneficial to food. Processing also can enhance the flavor, the taste, or the texture, and drying is another example of that because it helps concentrate the flavor and it actually creates a different texture from a fresh, as opposed to like a fresh version of like an herb. Dried food tastes, or dried herbs taste different and have a different texture. And then different processing methods can increase the safety. So like I said, like drying is a good example of you can take a fresh herb that has a lot of water in it, which increases its risk of mold growth or bacteria growth. But when you dry it, you remove that water. So you remove that likelihood that mold and bacteria can grow. So processing hopefully has a little bit of a better, has a little bit more of like a positive effect on herbs and spices than maybe what you thought before. And then I do want to just mention two examples of foodborne illness that are linked with herbs and spices products. And the first is salmonella. And this has been linked with dried herb and spices, contaminating those dried products. So if you went to the grocery store and you bought a dried container of basil or oregano or something else, those have there's a linkage between salmonella contaminating those. But the solution that processing has or a processing method that has created a solution for that potential contamination is there's a method called irradiation, so not radiation, but irradiation, that actually breaks apart those pathogens and helps to kill them, which makes your dried herbs and spices safe to eat. And we had already mentioned that CBOT or Clostridium botulinum is linked with contaminating or growing in those infused oils. And although it's rare, there is still that risk. And so to prevent symptoms like paralysis, the solution I would recommend is to follow a lab tested recipe. And there's a lot of extension departments across the country that have these lab tested recipes that you are more than welcome to use. And then of course, storing those infused oils safely is important too. And so the next thing we're just going to touch upon is how herbs and spices actually have a natural property to slow the growth and kill pathogens. And what that means is that herbs and spices are seen as an antimicrobial. And so there are a lot of different foods that are used as preservatives that help slow the growth and kill microorganisms that you might see on the ingredients lists of different foods. So acids do that, sugar does that, salt does that, and herbs and spices can as well. And there's some emerging research that herbs and spices might be a good substitute for some of the chemical agents that the food industry uses to preserve and extend the shelf life of different products. And the reason that's really cool and something that I hope more research is done on is herbs and spices are better tolerated by the body. They're a natural, element that we grow. And they also can eliminate, some of the research is showing they can eliminate or delay bacterial growth that is resistant to some of these chemical preservatives. So we might have a solution to that resistant bacteria by using herbs and spices. So again, more research is needed, but this is just promising for the future of the food industry. And then kind of the last piece I want to share with you guys about the food safety of herbs and spices is just keep in mind that cooking is always a good kind of last step to reduce the risk of foodborne illness contaminating your foods. Practice safe food handling, and part of that is washing your hands if you're seasoning, especially raw meat, poultry, and fish. As soon as I learned this, I really had to think in my cooking, like, am I the person who I'm seasoning a fillet of fish, I flip it over, even if it's with a utensil, and then I grab the container and of herbs and spices and I season the other side, and I've contaminated that container and then put it back in my my cabinet. So just things to keep in mind while you're in the kitchen. Keep those raw ingredients from the ready to eat separate, and to wash your hands or the containers themselves if you need to. All right, and lastly, we're going to talk about the health benefits of herbs and spices. There's a lot of health claims out there, and this is where I really want to encourage that you use discretion when you read or hear health claims that an herb or a spice has a guaranteed cure or it improves symptoms. Usually these are false. And unfortunately, a lot of it is the media hyping up and misrepresenting science that may suggest a health claim or may suggest like promising results, but it's not a cause and effect. And this is just one kind of example that we see here. It says peppermint oil has so many more uses: asthma, autism, brain injury, Crohn's disease, multiple sclerosis, paralysis. So that's kind of a lot. That's a lot of claims. And most often those big claims are just not true. And there's a lot of research out there on using herbs and spices for medicinal properties, but there is limited strong evidence that support these claims. And so we just need to wait and see what the research comes up with, whether there is a stronger correlation to some of these claims. So I've talked about phytochemicals and said the word antioxidants, but I want to explain that process a little bit more so that you understand why, if something contains antioxidants, it can promote your health. So antioxidants are a type of phytochemical that protects your cells from free radicals. And a free radical is something that attacks the cells in your body and it causes oxidative stress. Some examples of other things that cause oxidative stress would be medication, alcohol, air pollution. And when your cells undergo this oxidative stress, this leads to cell damage. It leads to inflammation, which increases your risk of developing chronic disease. Examples are like heart disease, rheumatoid arthritis, autoimmune disease, lupus, etc. So when we ingest and eat things that contain more antioxidants, it helps prevent that oxidative damage caused by free radicals, which lowers your inflammation, which lowers your risk of chronic disease. So that's what we mean by herbs and spices may have kind of a relationship to your health, in improving your health, because some do contain antioxidants. I think these are really cool resources to check out. Because they can help you kind of understand what science is out there about herbs and spices and these associated health claims. And they give like good summaries, and they're very like bluntly honest about how true or how credible those claims are. And so the one on the left that you're seeing is the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. This is their Herbs at a Glance webpage. You can search for various herbs and it'll give you a summary of what the scientists have learned about those herbs and any safety concerns in consuming herbs. The resource on the right is the McCormick Science Institute page, and it provides articles about herbs and spices, their associated health claims. You can scroll and see like summaries of what the science has found. You can search for specific herbs and spices and health claims. And I do want to make a note that there is not an affiliation, or there's not a connection of the company McCormick with this research-based institute in regards to funding or direction of the research. So if that's a concern, it was confirmed to me that someone had shared with me there is not an affiliation. So the real kind of health benefit that herbs and spices can bring to you is helping you to lower the amount of salt that you eat. And so for those who didn't know, about 9 out of 10 Americans actually eats more than double of the recommendations that the American Heart Association recommends that we have for salt each day. I said that in a very weird way. But too much salt in your diet can lead to an increased risk in various chronic diseases like high blood pressure, heart failure, kidney disease. It can cause you to have more headaches. It can increase your risk for stroke and other chronic conditions. So that's why it's good to try and replace salt when you can in recipes. That also involves cooking more at home, because a lot of foods that you eat out, when you eat out, a lot of those foods have more salt added to them. And so, you can add fresh herbs and spices, you can add dried, whatever you prefer. Try and use those instead of the salt shaker. And you also want to pay attention to the labels, because there are some, like garlic powder versus garlic salt. Garlic salt has salt in it still, whereas garlic powder does not. So you want to pay attention to the label and look for words like salt, or it's called sodium. And then some examples of spices and herbs that are good salt replacements are cumin, cayenne, paprika, black pepper, oregano, lemon peel, garlic, onion powder, and rosemary. So those are some examples. And then again, you want to, the ground and dried versions yield more intense flavor because they're much more concentrated in flavor. So you want to use 1/3 of the quantity if you're trying to substitute for a fresh herb. The other way that herbs and spices can benefit your health is by helping you to replace added sugars. And too much added sugar can increase your risk for different chronic conditions like diabetes and other diseases like related to the heart and other stuff. So, and unfortunately in the food industry, we just have tons of added sugar in a lot of our products. We see them in sodas, we see them in desserts, milk products, grain products. They're kind of all over the place. And so there are a lot of spices and herbs that can replace sugar, but the ones that you probably see more often in different recipes are things like cinnamon, nutmeg, allspice, fennel, green cardamom. Those are just a few examples. And what's great about these spices is they really help your tongue detect the natural sweetness of different foods. Rather than you focusing on, I'm searching for the added sugar, I am trying to search for the natural sugar and the natural sweetness in whatever food I'm eating. Okay, so herbal supplements, I just want to say a quick note about these. People will typically take these orally in a concentrated form, whether that's tablets, capsules, powders, or liquids. And again, I just want to stress, there's a lot of variation when it comes to the science about the healing properties, the biological effects, the medicinal use of herbs and spices. These supplements, excuse me. And so you just want to be careful and cautious if you choose to try these. And what I always tell people is if you do decide to try something new nutritionally, you want to bring this up to your healthcare team because they know your medical history. They know if you're taking certain medications, and they're going to know if there's going to be maybe a drug nutrient interaction that might occur or a side effect from having one of these supplements that you're not aware of. And so you always want to check with them about the safety of that. And the other thing is these herbal supplements are regulated by the FDA, but the FDA is not authorized to review dietary herbal supplements for their safety and effectiveness before they're marketed. So that's something of concern to kind of consider. And the other thing is if you like find a study that, supports a health claim and says this herbal supplement, is beneficial for your health in this way. A lot of times there's this misconception that like, that means just go take that herbal supplement. But the specific herbal supplement they may have researched may be very different from the one that you purchase from the store. So, and that does matter when it comes to that scientific finding. So it doesn't mean that all similar herbal supplements have that health claim. It's that very one that they studied, and that even needs more research just to verify that that's like a supported claim. So I'm just saying, be really cautious, bring it up to your healthcare team if you're interested, and talk with them about it. And then essential oils. We talked about this a little bit when we were talking about the cooking because it brings out those aromatic compounds. But I'm referring to the essential oils that you'll see people put in diffusers. And this is a liquid that's extracted from certain plants using steam or pressure. And you'll see it with a lot of different herbs and spices. And they're used in perfumes, they're used in food flavorings and medicine, and aromatherapy is a big one that people talk about. There are studies about using different aromatherapy to treat anxiety, nausea, vomiting, other health-related conditions, especially in cancer patients. That's what we found was there's mostly studies of how that it's called complementary alternative medicine and how aromatherapy benefits like cancer patients. But again, the findings are kind of inconclusive. There's not a lot of solid results. There's a lot of mixed results. So if you choose to try some of these methods of using essential oils for their health claims, talk with your healthcare provider, and ask them questions, especially if they know something that you don't know about, maybe like a side effect of using this. And then the last couple things I just wanted to share are the Home and Garden Information Center has a few web pages on herbs and then container gardening if you want to try and grow some of these things we talked about today. And then I also highly suggest, if you have more gardening questions, to reach out to your local extension office and ask to get in touch with the Master Gardener coordinator or the Master Gardener volunteers. Because they will offer classes and they can be a resource to you to help answer your gardening questions, especially if you don't have a green thumb like I don't. They can answer your questions. And so figure out what your local extension office's Master Gardener coordinator's contact information is. I wanted to make you guys aware that we got a new website. So this is a new Maryland Snap Ed webpage, and they offer budget-friendly, healthy recipes that you and your family can try, and you can search by ingredient and see if some of these dishes contain herbs and spices. And so I'm just trying to bring all of our UME programs together and show you that the Master Gardeners can help you grow these different herbs and spices. I can help you, with the preservation, or if you want to learn how to freeze them or dry them. And then Extension also offers a program called Food for Profit, which if you want to own a business, they can help you kind of navigate like the local and state regulations, food safety issues, and just kind of the management behind owning your own business. And then I'd like to acknowledge my colleagues who helped create this presentation. And then I do want to leave it open for some questions if you guys have anything for me. And then this is also my contact information. But I did want to ask Jackie if you don't mind sharing those 2 surveys with the group. So the one is a kind of evaluation of this program. So it's just asking you some content questions about what you learned and if you liked the program. And then the second survey is a teaching effectiveness survey. So that's about me and my teaching as an educator. I always welcome the good, the bad, the ugly feedback. And if you don't mind, please be constructive, because I always do read these. They're anonymous, but I read them and I try and make changes for future programs. And so there's I think 5 questions about me. There's a space for you to write in your feedback. And then the first few questions are just finding my name. So we're listed by last name, comma, first name. So you'll find me under Jewel, comma, Aaron. You'll click on today's date for the calendar. And I believe there's a food safety program option for this program. And I would consider this a food safety program. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will take any questions that you guys have.
Great. Thanks so much, Erin. We did have one come through. She thinks you might have answered it, but just to touch base on it, I'll pop it onto the screen there. So do trace amounts of nutrients have any benefits to our health?
Definitely. So thanks for the question, Robin. I think that hopefully that was answered with when we were talking about antioxidants, phytochemicals. So we're trying to reduce that oxidative stress that free radicals cause to the cells in our body. Very biology term, but that's just to say antioxidants protect our cells from that stress. They reduce our risk of inflammation and then moving on to increase our risk for chronic disease. So if we have more antioxidants, we reduce oxidative stress, we reduce inflammation, we reduce those chronic diseases. And I just almost got kicked off for a second. So hopefully that answered your question, Robin. If it didn't, feel free to email me or you can post another question up there.
And Erin, I will be able to, if you send me over those resources from the beginning of your slides, I will definitely get those posted onto the HSMP website for everyone, just right underneath of the recording for this webinar. Okay,
that sounds great. Definitely. And feel free to put my contact information too. So if anyone is watching this later and wants to follow up with me, I guess it was in the slides as well. So you could always pause it and email me.
Perfect. And we'll give it a second for any other questions to come through. And while that's happening, I will share maybe. There we go. Just that final slide for everyone. Thank you for participating tonight. And thank you, Erin, for these 2 presentations that you've done this month for us. Some upcoming events that we do have. August 27th, something special for the kiddos in the county. We're going to be having Food Plays to Be Fit, Juggling Nutrition Magic Show happening at 10 a.m. for kindergarten through 3rd grades, and then 1 p.m. for the later elementary, so 4th and 5th grades. That day, September 30th, we're going to be doing a morning yoga class with Lori Bruce as part of our HSMP annual meeting. And then we also are in the works of doing a couple in-person events as part of this series, doing some War Cycles events in September and October in partnership with the NAACP. So keep an eye out for the announcement of those and the registrations coming up soon. And if no other questions are coming through, again, feel free to email myself at stmaryspartnership@gmail.com or Erin, whose email was a few slides back there, with any questions that you have as follow-up. And thanks so much, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.